All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited to receive you and to share some of our knowledge with you and also introduce you to our very esteemed guest, Boris Strecansky, who was one of the student Velvet Revolution leaders. So just some protocol for today, or how the webinar will proceed. Gabriella and I, which are the authors of the book Czechoslovakia Behind the Iron Curtain, we will do kind of a brief crash course on communism or the communist experiment in Czechoslovakia before introducing Boris, who will then open the floor up for some Q&A, so you guys can go ahead and ask some questions about the Velvet Revolution, how it proceeded, whatever interests you. So first of all, just a kind of raison d'etre, why we decided to do this webinar. It has to do with the fact that with the topic of freedom. So as the authors of a newly released book, Czechoslovakia Behind the Iron Curtain, we really went over the course of the past several years very deeply into the communist experiment in Czechoslovakia, and we studied actually how a system of total control was enacted in a once free and democratic country. And right now we're seeing of course, it's a very different situation, the corona pandemic, the global pandemic, but we're seeing some parallels, at least in terms of coming into appreciation of just how difficult it must have been in communist Czechoslovakia to bring about change, to bring about the revolution. And particularly when you consider that there were entire generations that were born into this system. So it wasn't about, a one-year system where the Iron Curtain was erected and numerous freedoms were revoked. It went on for decades. So yes, let's move on. Actually, our tech master, Boris, actually another one who's joining us from Dubai. Can we put, yes, that first slide. So before we get started, we would love to just do a brief introduction to who we are. I know that some of you have joined us before. And so it'll be a little bit of a review. So Global Slovakia is a non-for-profit organization, and our mission is to share Slovakia with the world. And how we do this is we capture, codify, and communicate Slovakia's story, different historical experiences it's gone throughout the centuries, put it into the English language and kind of send it off into the world through books. Right now we've released 3. The most recent one is focusing on the communist experiment. It's a 600-page book with 200 illustrations, photographs, also archived materials that are really engaging and actually bring the story to life. We're also a non-for-profit organization, so we exist thanks to donations from people such as yourselves, to grants, and of course to book sales. So after this webinar is over, we will be sending out an email, if hopefully won't bother you, either asking for a contribution or supporting us through the purchasing of one of our books, either in e-form or in hard copy off of Amazon. And before we go into the content, we just want to quickly introduce kind of ourselves, so just to legitimate our position a little bit more. So Gabriella and I are both academic scholars. We have our PhDs from the United Kingdom. We studied the Slovak context from different lenses and angles. I from migration, she from the lens of corruption. Moreover, I was born in communist Czechoslovakia, but about 1 year before the revolution, my parents defected. So that means we were one of the few that towards the end of the regime, on the kind of the tail end of the communist experiment, fled Slovakia, illegally defected, entered the free world, which then was Austria, went through the various refugee camps while we were waiting for immigration papers to go further west. Many people went to Germany, Austria, or the dream was actually to go into the New World where there was more opportunities. My parents had that dream. So we ended up immigrating to Canada, where we naturalized as citizens. I then was raised between Canada and the US. Before I went on to live in 10 different countries across 4 different continents, living, working, studying in these societies. Most recently, I was in the United Kingdom, and that's where I had the wonderful opportunity to meet Gabriella when we were both doing our PhDs there on full scholarship. Gabriella?
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to connect with you again. It's Zuzana pretty much covered it all, so it's just a quick hello from me, and just to say what a pleasure and honor it is to share our work and our experience and our research with you now, with our book, and with many other activities that we have. I was born in Slovakia, behind the Iron Curtain. This is the country where I grew up during the transitional years, mainly. And after that, after I completed my master's education at the Slovak University, I went abroad and I lived in Spain, in the UK, and in the Middle East. And it was in the UK where I continued my education and where I finished my doctoral degree in corruption and in the mindset of Slovakia and Central Europe. So I think that's so much from me. We should have everybody on board.
Just checking with you guys, is there any kind of, how's the sound quality? Are you able to hear us?
I can hear.
Oh yeah, okay, great, because I was just getting some static. So if
yeah, I got static too, but I can hear you.
Okay, great, all right. Okay.
Just a little.
Last question. Can you see the presentation?
Yeah, we can. Can we go to the next slide with the hammer and sickle, please, Boris? Thank you.
And also for everyone involved, we will encourage and we welcome questions at the end of the presentation. And while we are presenting, we'd really appreciate if you could mute yourself if you happen to be unmuted. So the hearing experience is good for everyone. Thank you. Okay. So before going into the details, let us guide you through the key events of how a Central European country turned communist and remained communist for over 4 decades. So here is the bigger picture of communism in Slovakia.
Gabby, do you have headphones? Yeah. I think it will help with the static.
I do, but when I put them in, no, I don't actually. I don't.
Okay.
Yeah. Afraid nothing I can do about it.
Okay, no problem.
So let's see. I'll speak slowly. So a quick run through the timeline of communism in Czechoslovakia. We have to begin with the end of the Second World War, which was the greatest armed conflict in the history of humanity. That came only 2 decades after the First World War. So we have to appreciate the context of it. People alive back then, many of them had the lived experience of 2 global conflicts. And the years after the World War, once the jubilations were over, were up to, the country was destroyed. The people were in shock and in trauma. The economy was not in the best shape. And Czechoslovakia also had experienced some difficult weather conditions. So the harvest in the year coming up to the communist takeover of power was poor. So people were fearing starvation. It was no theoretical threat. This was very real for them. So this is the kind of context we found ourselves in after the Second World War. 3 years went by, there were democratic elections in Czechoslovakia, and the Communist Party got in as a part of the coalition government. And in 1948, can you hear me?
It's really bad, Gabby. It's It's super scratchy.
Maybe you need to take over.
Okay, all right. So you guys can hear me, yeah? All right, so are we still on the first slide? Or we've moved on to the second. All right, so as Gabriela was saying, we kind of have to understand why communism was appealing, because communism would have never been implemented in Czechoslovakia had there not been a buy-in from the people. And so we're looking at the destruction of World War II, the survivors returning back to their cities, their respective towns, villages, cities, and seeing bombed buildings, witnessing the impact of death. At this point, everyone had someone that had died in their family or had known of someone that had died. So we're actually seeing a pretty traumatized population from the horrors of war. And what is more, they don't have much security and stability or a sense of what is to come in the future after a long 6-year conflict. So they're very scared. So they're in a quite powerless, vulnerable state where actually they were feeling a great amount of lack. There wasn't even economic stability. There was actually famine. Especially after the war, when there wasn't enough food to eat for people. And that is so recent. That's not like generations ago, but that's the story of our grandmothers, of our great-grandmothers who had to share, a loaf of bread with 10 different siblings. And not knowing if that loaf of bread would be there on the table tomorrow. So when communism came and it offered the people a new ideology, that of building a more just society that was based on the inversion of the traditional hierarchy, which was, if we imagine it in the sense of a pyramid, you had generally the peasants and the workers at the bottom forming the mass of it. And the more you moved up, the higher you went up in skill, in competence, but also in wealth and power. And what the communist ideology was all about was about building a system where, for the first time ever in history, the proletariat, the workers and the peasants, which is codified in the very emblem of communism, which is the hammer is for the worker and the sickle is for the peasant. For the first time ever in history, the proletariat would rule. So this was very, very attractive. It gave people hope, and they were very keen to try something radically different from what was before, because what was before was just war and destruction. Most recently, the worst war in global history that had some 60 million deaths. And before that, just 20 years prior to that, was the First World War, which again wreaked a lot of havoc and death on the European, or saw a lot of havoc and death wreaked upon the European continent. So the communists actually were voted into power, and in Slovakia there's a saying that communism didn't come from the East, but it actually came from the West, and what they're referring to is not the geopolitical West, but rather the Czech Republic. The Czech people, which were not as deeply as religious as the Slovak people, actually were keen to try this progressive new system. So the communists were voted into power, but still it was a parliamentary system with Democrats also in place in the parliament. However, for the communists, this was not enough. They wanted to rise into total control, or perhaps that was not the immediate goal, but they certainly wanted to consolidate more power so that they could have more control over the institutions, the ministries, and of course, the populace of Czechoslovakia. So communist coup was orchestrated through various political maneuvers, but also by arming the workers and peasants. So the Communist Party illegally weaponized the society, or the lowest ranks of society, to whom bringing about this radical revolution, this radical inversion of the traditional social structure would benefit. So this was called the working class's fist, and it was basically a militia, of an informal militia of people that just really bought into the belief system of communism. So after 1948, after the coup, when the communists seized total control of the parliament, we started to witness a pretty severe and stark backsliding of freedoms. So what were the freedoms that began to be revoked again in this once democratic and free and pretty progressive society? The first republic, Czechoslovakia, was very modern, also in terms of being one of the first countries in Europe to give women the right to vote. So if we can change the slide, Boris, please.
Yes, but before we move on, we have a question, so I would like to quickly stop because maybe it's relevant. It's from David Frankel. He had a question on chat saying, "Can you speak, please, a little bit more about the elections of 1948? I've heard that in Czech, Moravian lands, the communists won elections, but in Slovakia, the communists didn't prevail. Is this correct? What actually happened in that time?"
Okay, so that actually happened before.
One more. There's a second question on elections.
Yeah, I see that. You know what? Just because can we actually? What we're going to do is we're going to answer these questions at the end.
Okay, so I'll take a note of them. Okay.
Yeah, and actually, if we're able to see the names of we weren't able to save the chat last time, that's why we couldn't address any of those questions. So whatever questions, whatever key questions we're not able to address in this webinar, because we do want to kind of keep it within an hour and a half, we will address in a follow-up video recording or a follow-up webinar where we can specifically address the questions for the public. So if you don't mind, if we can go to the next slide.
Yeah. So before we move on, so David and Michael, I took a note from your questions. We'll either come back or we'll answer in the other webinar. Okay. So next slide.
Yeah. Okay. Oops. Sorry. But please continue to ask your questions. Like, don't let this discourage you. They will be addressed. Yeah. Okay.
I took a note of them.
Okay, great. So the next slide is one more, please. All right. So what were the key freedoms or the civil liberties that they revoked from the people? That was freedom of movement, that was freedom of gathering, as it's listed, freedom of religion, freedom of information, and freedom of expression. Now, I just want to go a little bit deeper to explain what that means. So freedom of movement, as we know, for 4 decades, the Czechoslovak people, as were all the populaces from the Eastern Bloc, from the Soviet bloc, they were geographically contained. It was virtually impossible to travel west unless under very exceptional circumstances, be it for diplomats, athletes, star scientists. This is because there was an Iron Curtain that was erected or began to be erected shortly after the coup. And this Iron Curtain was virtually impenetrable. It was a barbed wire fence that spanned the length of the Czechoslovak border with Austria and Germany. And it was guarded by watchtowers, as well as guards that had the Czechoslovak version of the AK-47, under the instructions to shoot at any defectors. So that's where freedom of movement was denied. Freedom of gathering. Now, as we know, when people come together, they have the power to share information, to build trust with one another, therefore build alliances. And then also in the form of a collective, the we is definitely stronger than the me. So they have a capacity to empower one another and mobilize one another, building a critical mass for a cause, let's say for a revolution or a counter-revolution. So the communists were extremely paranoid about people power. They didn't trust the populace. So freedom of gathering was suppressed, and it was suppressed by it being suspicious of a group of more than 3 persons per se would be meeting in a public square. There was a lot of formal and informal surveillance. So people knew that they were being watched, and these people were, if they were, let's say, routinely meeting in a cluster, would be documented, a dossier would be opened, they would be followed, they would be harassed, etc. So freedom of gathering was suppressed. Freedom of religion, they couldn't quite directly eliminate religion because it held so much influence and power in the region, particularly in Slovakia. However, through social conditioning, they could program the religion. They could program the people to believe religion was inferior. For the more modernizing classes, of course, there's the famous words of Karl Marx, who said, religion is the opium for the masses. In the Czech Republic in particular, they converted a lot of churches to become farmsteads. So animals would be farmed there. And those that did continue to go to church, let's say for Sunday Mass, or continue to have out in the open baptisms, there were repercussions for that. Either they would be downgraded in their position, they would lose their job, or they would lose the right to a car that they were on the queue for, waiting list for, or an apartment, or ultimately the access to education for their children would be revoked. So there was all kinds of soft and hard punishments that occurred when you didn't comply with the system. And one of the reasons I want to stress why religion was banned was because it was a competitor. Now the communists were all about, they were obsessed with consolidating power, and then once in power, maintaining total control over the society. And they were very nervous or felt very threatened by any other competing belief system, in this case, Christianity or the church, which to them, the Vatican was just now another power apparatus that held sway and influence over the lives of people. And in the case of Czechoslovakia, and particularly Slovakia, this was an incredible influence for centuries upon centuries. So the next in line, we have freedom of information. As we all know, censorship was enforced, but why did they censor information? Because they understood that knowledge and information is extremely powerful. And if people get hold of this knowledge and information, they would have the capacity, let's say, to mobilize once again for a cause and create a counter-revolution to the revolution the communists were building. So they started censoring information. They had essentially a hegemony over all media. So we're looking at print, we're looking at television, we're looking at radio waves. Of course, there was a complete control by the party over the education system. This was very important because the education system was the avenue for cultivating the new human capital that would build the socialist empire. Sometimes the censorship was extremely crass. There would be entire pages or sections of a school textbook that would be glued together if there was unfavorable information within that book, or they would just be plain cut out. Let's say there was a poem that spoke about something that countered the common narrative or was a blacklisted topic. That poem would actually just be cut out. And lastly, there was the Iron Curtain, which was literally a barrier to incoming information. Radio signals from the West would be scrambled. Thankfully, Bratislava was able to catch a lot of the Austrian and Vienna radio programs, but that was not the case for Central and Eastern Slovakia. And it was very, very difficult. There was an entire kind of ecosystem around smuggling in forbidden books. And these forbidden books were as risque as a Shakespeare play or Plato's philosophy about democracy. And once these books came in, they would then be smuggled in an underground network where a family or an individual would get the book for 24, 48 hours before it would have to be passed on to the next person in line. That's just how hot the demand was for these products. And lastly, freedom of expression. Now, freedom of expression was suppressed because the communist ideology didn't acknowledge the individual and his individuality. It didn't necessarily value or cultivate an appreciation for a subjective perspective on an issue, on a given topic. Okay, so in the education system, you would have a teacher that would be the sole authority on knowledge. This teacher would disseminate the knowledge he or she knows, and the students were expected to memorize and repeat. This is called the rote model of education. It's a practice that's actually practiced in many places, even to this day in some countries. And it's one where the premise is to create a human capital that is capable of absorbing information and repeating it. Usually this kind of education system is handy for industrializing society, not for a knowledge-based society that's dependent on innovation and services. So the education system also reflected the economic needs of the society, which was, in Slovakia's case, a modernizing country from the 1960s. So until then, we were predominantly agrarian population. If we could go to the next slide, please. All right, so some of the tools of oppression that were used included show trials. What was this? Well, these were kind of theatrical farces of a legal process that were often televised or put on radio waves, where somebody who was inconvenient to the party was put on trial, was accused of being an enemy of the state. Someone, let's say, who was a threat to the people or betraying communism. Then they were accused, many of these accusations were false. They were often forced to repeat a statement admitting to the crime and sentenced to prison or death. So there were, especially after the coup, quite a, I actually don't have the exact number in my head right now, but quite a bit of people that were executed. One of the most famous is Milada Hordak. Can someone help me? Milada Hordak.
Horniakova.
Horniakova, ďakujem, sorry.
Horáková.
Yes, and there's also a Netflix movie actually about her. Sorry, I lost her second name. And so that was very unfortunate. And why were these show trials orchestrated? So they served a dual purpose. First of all, when the communists seized power, they needed to purge, as I said, inconvenient people. The first purge, of course, was the political opposition. So it was the Democrats that were in power, that knew the political process. They were a threat to the communists. So they were liquidated, put in jail, punished, executed. This also applied to people who were once believers in communism. So individuals who were, let's say, from the intelligentsia class, who believed in the value of this communist ideology and of building a new world. Actually, unfortunately, they were also put in prison or executed. Clement Gottwald was not far in terms of behaviors from his idol, Joseph Stalin. So he was incredibly paranoid. He executed a lot of people from his core team in those iconic show trials in the early 50s. So the first line of purging was the political opposition. The second line of purging was the intelligentsia. These were people that were capable of having free thought. Often they were influential. Often they had a vast network of connections. They were, of course, a threat to the communist regime, so they were eliminated. After the intelligentsia, there were the kulaks. Now this happened more during the collectivization process, which is the next point, is when the government or the party decided to seize private enterprises or successful farms and make them state-run. Of course, these wealthy farmers that had been doing this practice for generations were not so keen on having take their land and redistribute them in the name of collectivization, so they resisted. So those that resisted, some were killed, some were put in prison. And this happened not just in Czechoslovakia, this happened across the Soviet bloc. After the kulaks, of course, another threat were the wealthy entrepreneurs. Again, those were people that had money, sway, know-how. They were a threat. And last but not least was the religious opposition. So these were the priests and nuns that were disseminating Christianity, therefore representing the interests of the church, the Vatican, in Czechoslovakia. And of course, in the eyes of the communists, these were the envoys of the Vatican. So they had to be purged, they had to be eliminated. So you can just imagine what kind of state the society was in after eliminating all those layers or putting them under into prison or under duress. Again, that's that whole ideology of inverting the hierarchy that had previously existed and making a society where the workers and peasants rule. The next point is censorship. Now we already discussed that. There was an information blackout that was imposed upon Czechoslovakia. Following that, of course, an architecture of oppression through surveillance was implemented. So secret police were established, and these were to monitor the behavior of the people and to punish anyone that stepped out of line. What was more scary was not only that there were thousands and thousands of secret police officers that were, you know, listening to phone calls, observing people in public, the eyes and ears of university classrooms and offices. There was also a vast informal network of informers that were willing to snitch on their friends, family, neighbors to gain certain advantages or privileges, be it a holiday to Yugoslavia, moving up the list to get that coveted car. Or at the same time, we have to remember that there were also people that really believed in the ideology. So they thought they were, by reporting on any kind of behavior that was, let's say, antisocial, they were actually helping to get rid of the resistance to building this new dreamland. As we already touched upon, education system came under state control. This was really, really interesting and very, very important to the communists. I'm going to actually quote Vladimir Lenin here, where I'm going to say, he said, "Give us a child for 8 years and it will be a Bolshevik forever." So the communists were extremely clever in understanding that it wasn't so much about changing the mindsets of the generation that were adults after the war, but it was really about the next generation, about their children that were blank slates that could be socially conditioned or programmed to become loyal to communism. And it would be this generation, the generation born after the war, that would really help expand the communist empire. And of course, there was a lot of psychological manipulations. One of them was fear. One of them was, of course, threat, and especially the threat of going after the bloodline, which is punishing not the culprit, but going after his children. So this really made people think twice of stepping out of line, of voicing their concerns, of having a counter mainstream narrative, because they really kind of acquiesced their lives and their freedoms in the hope that their children would actually have a better life, in the hope and the understanding that their children would not be punished. Can we go to the next slide? Gabby, how's your sound? Gabby? Hold on. Gabby? No. Gabby?
Yeah, I'll
Yes,
stop.
I can hear you on.
So can we just give, because how's your sound? Can we try you again?
It's just very choppy again, so.
It's sounding better actually right now.
It is.
Let's try.
Many apologies to everyone. I'm in a Muslim country, and the hour before the fast for the day breaks, the internet is just down because everybody is on it. So that's what's happening here.
Gabriela, I'm also in the Muslim country, and I have to tell you it's the same, because everybody starts celebrating Iftar because it's a month of Ramadan. So I'm in Dubai, and I had to go on VPN to be on the internet in England to be able to have this call. So it's the same. And just on a positive note, we are nearly.
I'm not so technologically savvy.
On a positive note, we are nearly 50 people on this call. So thank you everybody for
Thank you.
coming.
Thank you everyone for joining. It's such a great pleasure to share what we know with you, and hopefully it's an added value into your lives this evening or maybe longer.
Yeah, I see people from all around the world here, which is great. Stop sharing the PowerPoint for a moment so we can all see each other.
Okay, yes, let's look.
All right, so shall we continue?
Yes, please.
Okay. Can you see the slides?
Yeah, is Gabby there, or did she drop out?
Sorry, no, my.
All right. So, Gabby, you fix your problem and just jump in, okay? Anytime. You okay? Okay. All right. So then one of the key signposts of the Czechoslovak communist experiment was about 20 years into communism, which was 1968. And it's actually very interesting to observe that the major milestones happened actually at what you would say is a generational exchange, 20 years. So here we have the 1960s. Now we need to understand what was happening in Czechoslovakia in a wider context of kind of liberalization all around the world. You know, you had the 60s movement for a free love, let's say, and birth control and Woodstock concerts in America. And in Czechoslovakia, which was, you know, it was a suppressed communist country behind the Iron Curtain, but there was the Prague Spring movement. There was of course, the iconic Slovak Alexander Dubček, and what is referred to as the Prague Spring reforms, which was a kind of opening of Czechoslovakia to the world, a softening of the harsh policies, perhaps reintroducing freedom of press, or that was one of the promises, and also freedom of movement. And during this era, we saw the borders actually relax, and for the first time in 2 decades, and actually foreigners be able to come into Czechoslovakia in bigger numbers than just a tiny trickle. Unfortunately, Czechoslovakia is also situated in the very heart of Europe. It's also an industrially advanced country, one of the most industrially advanced countries in the Soviet bloc. It was also a major weapons manufacturer. It had many artillery factories, especially in the eastern part of the country. So it was of strategic interest to Moscow. So Moscow, as we know, or the USSR, Russia, is the originator of communism. It's actually the first time where communist ideology was implemented. It started a revolution. It saw the Tsar and his family executed and the Bolsheviks put into power. Once they were in power after the Second World War, also due in part to what is referred to as the Soviet sacrifice, which is millions and millions and millions. We're looking at 20 million people of Russian Soviet origin dying in the effort to stop Hitler. In fact, about 80% of Hitler's army actually perished in Central and Eastern Europe. So Russia, or the Soviet Union, was one of the Allied countries. After it helped to liberate these many countries in Central and Eastern Europe, there was the meeting of Churchill, the 3 powers, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, and this is how Europe was divided. So Russia, or USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, had a hegemony over Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was a Soviet satellite state. It was part of the Soviet bloc, but it was also extremely strategic because it bordered the West. So it was the contact point, was the buffer zone between the USSR, which was Ukraine, which is Slovakia's neighbor to the east, and Austria, Germany. So it did not want to lose Czechoslovakia to the West, to democracy, to freedom. And although that's not what Dubček said, of course, there was that fear with liberalization, with an opening of Czechoslovakia, it would, of course, leave this Red Empire. And secondly, they couldn't afford to lose Czechoslovakia because it was producing all this valuable artillery, which they needed for their various war efforts, including proxy wars in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and various other countries, for example, in Africa. We have to understand, yes, the Cold War was cold, but it was a war. And the war played out on different geographies, not necessarily in Europe. So what we saw was a trigger response from Moscow. Of course, this was framed as an effort to help the Soviet Brotherhood, to help Czechoslovakia stop the counter-revolution that Dubček was igniting. What is very interesting, Czechoslovakia, a country of 15 million people, was invaded in August 1968 by 500,000 Warsaw Pact soldiers. So it was a Soviet-led Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. One of the reasons it was a Warsaw Pact invasion, not just a Soviet invasion, was that The Soviets were very aware of optics. It would not look good if just the USSR invaded, but if the entire Union, the Warsaw Pact, invaded, it would soften somehow this invasion. And next in line was the framing that they were helping to stop the counter-revolution, and that actually was the Czechoslovak leadership. And indeed, there was a letter with certain signatures of very high-ranking political officials that was sent to Moscow asking for help. So after the invasion, an occupation followed, and this occupation lasted for 2 decades. There were Soviet bases, which included nuclear warheads, which included warheads. I'm not sure if they were nuclear. And numerous places also in Bratislava, and 3 different bases in the Czech Republic. So there were Soviet troops, that about 73,000 that were not, let's say, visible to the everyday Czechoslovak citizen. They were discreetly hidden at various military bases, but we were not occupied country for 2 decades. What followed was, of course, a changing of leadership. A new person was put into power, which was Gustav Husak. He was also Slovak. We have to understand that the Soviets had a particular liking to Slovaks because they viewed the Slovaks were less resistant to them. The Czechs, which were industrially much more advanced, which under Austria-Hungary had their own kingdom, which had a much wider intelligentsia, and also counter-revolution movement, resistance movement, or dissident movement, as is the word used in this case. They were concentrated in Prague. So they really didn't trust the Czechs, and they trusted the Slovaks. So they like to put Slovaks into the Prague castle. And there's a lot of different kind of rhetoric, sayings that emerge, which is when people would go to Prague castle, which was the seat of the communist power apparatus, they would say, yeah, that everyone speaks Slovak there. So Gustav Husak was put in. He was a puppet for the Soviets. He's someone that actually went through, he has a very interesting life. He went through, he was punished, he was put in prison. I'm not exactly sure, I think Boris can correct me, for quite an amount of years, definitely over 5. He was someone who originally really believed in the ideology, and as his reign showed, perhaps he did for those 20 years, because he's the one that brought in normalization. So what was normalization? Normalization was a period of returning things back to normal. So stopping the reforms or the innovation that Dubček had ignited in the society, and returning society and policies and operations to how they were before the Prague Spring, before this movement for change. What resulted was actually a lot of stability, but also a lot of stagnation. And when you talk to the older generation today, 30 years after the revolution, they actually have a certain nostalgia for this Husak era, because it was very stable. Every day was the same. There wasn't instability, there wasn't threat, and I guess a threat of insecurity. So I guess to a certain extent, or to a certain segment of the population, it really benefited them. But of course, it stifled innovation, it stifled the economy, and ultimately it led to the revolution. Can we go to the next slide? All right, so the result of all this was, as we have here, a passive citizenry. I really don't want to talk much more. I just want to make some key points so you understand what it was like. So just imagine it. What you're seeing is a population that was turned from subjects of their reality into objects of their reality. And this was done systematically and over the course of generations. So you had a population through the education system that was taught how to think, how to speak, how to behave. And if they thought, spoke, and behaved in accordance to the norms of that society, according to the norms of communism, they were rewarded for it. So in many ways, obedience, discipline, or what some would call powerlessness, was rewarded. And any expressions of, let's say, agency or the free will to act sovereignly was punished. And, you know, you can have, imagine like it, you can have that in the first generation of the war, after the war, you know, certain people that resisted that were then purged. But now it becomes a lot more easier to control population if you can raise their children into buying into this ideology, into buying into that it's better to follow, it's better to be disciplined and listen to the authority than to question it, and definitely better than to challenge it, because certain punishments will follow, soft and hard. So you had a population that was not necessarily capable of critical thinking, was definitely, as if you're not able to think critically about things, of course, we're speaking in generalities here. There were pockets of dissident movements, there were pockets of intelligentsia, there were counter-revolutionary segments of society, but we're speaking as a whole right now in generalities. So if you have a population that's not able to critically think for itself subjectively, you have a population that's not capable of innovation. You have a population that's not capable of imagination. You had a population that was really channeled into developing its left brain, because the right brain, creativity, subjectivity, intuition, was suppressed through the education system. Going back to the ideals of communism, which was about building a collectivist society where the we superseded the me. The value of the group was more important. The well-being of the group was more important than the lone opinion of the individual. Okay? Lastly, you had a population that was collectively dependent on the state. And that kind of applies to any kind of authoritarian regime. In addition to freedom of movement and freedom of gathering and the other freedoms that were revoked, the freedom to provide a livelihood for yourself was also taken away from the people. And Martin Luther King says, communism robs man of that quality which makes him a man. And this can be interpreted as that individual free spirit sovereignty that we all carry, our soul, and our ability to enact that individuality, but it can also be interpreted as the ability to provide a livelihood for yourself. So in the collectivization process, national assets were collectivized. So the party, or let's say the council of men that were the party, seized that into state control, but they also seized family-run businesses into state control. So what maybe if you had a little shop that provided food or lamps or whatever service to the people, you could no longer do that. So it broke the capacity of people to go out into society and through their own sovereign thinking, through their own skills, through their own hands, create something and use that to provide a livelihood for themselves and for their families. Instead, people were dependent on the jobs that were allocated to them by the system. And I think that's really key. And that's actually one of the reasons why the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Slovakia is so lagging, and is lagging in many countries in the former Soviet bloc, was because this entrepreneurial know-how was literally wiped out for 4 generations. There was no competition between service providers, there was no marketing, and of course there was no integration into a global market. So they were completely removed from global markets. So it's a know-how that 30 years later we're still catching up on, because it's not something we learned from our parents. We're learning it on our own skin, which there's certainly advantages to that as well. So Gabby, how are we doing? No. All right, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so as there's any kind of oppressive system, or any kind of system, whether good or bad, there's always a counter system, a counterculture. In Czechoslovakia, this was the counterculture of the dissidents. These were predominantly the intellectuals, the creative class, that found the lack of freedom in society suffocating. They're also the children of parents that perhaps benefited from the communist regime, or the stability in terms of an income, in terms of housing, and in terms of a job that communism did provide the people after the Second World War. But now their children, evolution was happening. Now their children were born and they wanted more than what was being offered. You also had a resistance movement that was the secret church, which was, again, the segment of the population that was religious, that was orientated to God, that wanted to have freedom of religion, that wanted to go to church and pray during Sunday Mass, that wanted to baptize their children without having to do it in an underground network in some other city or town. So they wanted God back in their lives. And they actually had one of the first mass demonstrations in Czechoslovakia in 1988, which was pretty emotional. It was hundreds of people that gathered in the square in Bratislava. A lot of them were actually grandmothers from local villages. And as they were being sprayed down by the water cannons by the police that had been ordered to shut down or to suppress the dissent or to suppress the demonstration, they were holding candles and singing religious songs, so church songs. So it's a very, very emotional moment actually in the society that occurred before 1989, before the revolution, that actually brought the regime down. And another very pivotal moment in empowering kind of the religious believers of Czechoslovakia was the fact that Pope John Paul II became the Pope of the Catholic Church in the Vatican, and he was the first person of Slavic descent to ever become a pope. And there has been, of course, no Slav since him. So he was a kind of symbol of a return to spirituality, of a return to to Christianity in the non-religious world, gray world of communism. And lastly, there were those escapees. So there were two major waves of people that defected. That was first in 48, and then it was in 68 after the invasion. These people became emigres in Germany, but also predominantly in America, in Canada, and in Australia. My parents and I were among them. This community grew in power. They started to organize. They formed a Slovak Union. And they also were very interested in supporting dissident or resistance movements and bringing about change in communism, because they wanted to, these were families that were separated. So they wanted to reconnect, kind of like North and South Korea, reconnect with their bloodlines, reconnect with their families over the divide. Okay, next slide. So finally, we had 1989, which was the big moment. It was the Velvet Revolution. And what's really fascinating is that we had to understand that for 41 years, there was a tyrannical system in place, a system of total control. And in 240 hours, that tyrannical system of total control, that it was completely inconceivable that it would collapse, came crumbling down. And how did that happen? Well, there's numerous geopolitical reasons for that. Of course, there's also the fall of the Berlin Wall that happened earlier in November 7th, I believe, before the Iron Curtain came down in Czechoslovakia. It was like a puzzle piece it was a cluster of different pieces that came together that created a momentum, a movement. But it also happened thanks in part of people having the audacity to come together in large numbers. So the freedom to gather, and that gathering grew from first a few people to tens of people to hundreds of people to tens of thousands of people. And it happened not just in the capital cities of Prague and Bratislava, but throughout the country. Also in Eastern Slovakia, also in smaller towns, in bigger cities, etc. Now, Boris is obviously our special guest tonight. He actually lived through it. He was one of the leaders of that movement, student leaders of that movement. He will tell you more. I just want to finish off with 2 points. One of the reasons I believe, or we believe, the Velvet Revolution was able to come about was actually through 2 generations coming together in the name of one cause. And that had to do with the students first coming out, placing certain demands for better conditions in their universities, not exactly asking for, an overthrow of the regime, and the police the police coming down on them very brutally. This being captured via the media, then transmitted throughout televisions. The parents of those students saw this, and it was like that secret, that tacit agreement that they had made with the state, that they would be obedient, that they would be disciplined, that they would listen to the authority if their children could have a better future, if their children could have access to education. By seeing the state, by the organ of the state, which was the police, coming down with batons on their very kids, that like snapped that cord in half, that snapped that agreement. And that's when you saw flooding of multiple generations going out. First, the young, the youth, of course, the hopeful that had nothing to lose per se, and then their parents coming out to join them. So it became an intergenerational effort. And that is what really accelerated the Velvet Revolution process. So let me introduce you now to the man you've been waiting for. So Boris, as I said, was first of all born and raised in Bratislava, so that means born and raised in communism. And what's really remarkable is that he was one of the students that not just participated, but actually led the dissident movement, led the Velvet Revolution. And after the fall of communism, he actually continued working with civil society. And as you can imagine, in those 40 years, there was virtually no civil society. So he has dedicated his life to empowering people, to empowering institutions, to speak up, to express their concerns, so that our country can become a fully functioning democracy. So Boris, welcome.
Thank you, Susanna and Gabriela. Thank you for having me here. So let me introduce myself to you. As Susanna mentioned, I was born and raised in Bratislava. I happen to be a senior student in a senior year at the Comenius University during the 1989. And I joined these events in the role of a student activist, and my background is in history and philosophy. And as Susanna rightly said, most of my professional life has been spent in developing the concept of civil society and the non-profit organization capacity in Slovakia as well as in the other post-communist countries. This is basically a space and field of my specialization, and I'm currently doing a PhD at the Comenius University, and also focus on the idea of civil society legitimacy. I've co-founded several non-profit organizations. One of them, Center for Philanthropy, which is operating in Slovakia and is trying to cultivate and to nurture the private initiative for common good by offering services to foundations as well as encouraging generosity and I would call it pro-social attitudes and pro-social behavior and giving as a source for healthy civil society. So I was invited here to share with you some of my story and some of my experience from the 1989 and from what I've experienced and how I lived through it, and I'll be also happy to answer your questions.
Okay, great. Can I just ask actually the viewers right now, and Boris, our tech master, you're going to need to unblock the mics on people. What are the first questions you would like to ask Boris? And I would actually ideally like to start with kind of a generalized questions before we go into the specifics. So who would like to go first?
Is there a way to unblock everybody with one button?
I think this tech is smart. So when someone maybe starts talking, it registers them somehow. So are there, I can start with the first question. Okay, I can set the mood. So Boris, I have a question. Now that, like, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, now that we're in quarantine, I'm in India personally, we're under lockdown, we're not allowed to leave our houses. We're something like 50 days into that. We can walk our neighborhood, but we can't really traverse the city. It's sealed. I'm personally developing a much greater appreciation of what it was like to live under communism, to live in this kind of oppressive system where you're really scared. Like, you know, you do the wrong thing, you're going to be punished. You do the wrong thing, your neighbor's going to report you that you're out of the house, you know, and like, this is just happening for a couple months now. And I'm already feeling this kind of contraction, and I have to psychologically work with myself being like, no, this is temporary, you know, this is not going to last forever, and don't sink into fear. And I'm just thinking, you know, in Czechoslovakia, this happened for generations. And I'm going to say something like, for the generation that was born on the tail end of communism or in the era of freedom, when we talk amongst ourselves, we don't understand why our parents and grandparents didn't just like come together and just like cut through that barbed wire, you know, like they did on December 10th when 150,000 Bratislavans walked to free Vienna. You know, why did it take 4 decades? And now that I'm experiencing a soft form of it in a very different context, I just have so much appreciation. So I want to know, how was it possible that you were at this breaking point where people decided to ask for more freedom?
So I know now how to unmute all, so I will now unmute all, but please try to be silent so we have a clear voice. So I'm unmuting all.
You know what? Just mute everybody and let's get him to answer the question. And then...
Yes, Susanna, can you please repeat your last part of your question, because I haven't heard it. It's been already noise in the background. I cannot hear you.
Yeah, I unmuted okay. Susanna now.
So yeah, just mute me, shut me off. So how is it possible that, like, how was it possible that the people that were caged were able to rise, at least stick their heads up above the cage, and then ultimately bring about a revolution after 4 decades?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so if that's the question, I mean, I would say the following. There is one well, whatever. I would say that 4 decades is perhaps a little bit an exaggeration. In the 60s, there was a release and the ice was melting, and for a short period of time, borders were open. So the society had experienced already a freedom of movement. People were able to travel freely to Austria and as well as to other countries. And I think that experience was really formative also for the 1989. So it wasn't that there would be people blocked and caged for 40 years continuously. There was this break in the 60s, and in my answer to your question, and that would be that after those 20 years, people still remembered what it is to be in a, move freely, what it is to be thinking in a free way. And I think that those memories from the 1968 had basically been fueling also this desire for freedom. And the second one is that, yes, there is this syndrome, like, well, of a zoo. Let's imagine a zoo where you have animals which are bred and raised, and then suddenly the cage gates are open, but these animals are not able to live in a wild, because they have been used and they had been primed and formed to live in the zoo. And I really think that this was a little poor analogy to what I think we were, the situation that we were in the 1989. Even if the gates of the cage were open, the barbed wire, the iron curtain fell, I think on a more higher level, I think as a society, we needed to learn how to live in a free world, in a free context, in the free society where you don't have this omnipotent state that is watching over you, where you are to be responsible for your actions, where you are the one who should be making decisions on your behalf. And I think that's a much larger problem. I think that short moment of the 10th December, or the time when really the barbed wire was cut, and we went, I mean, in thousands of people were taking their Skodas and Ladas and were driving to Vienna or to Austria, or just walking across the border. It was just it was partly symbolic, but it was partly a kind of a mass response. I mean, because because the society was also not completely isolated, and I noticed one of the questions in the chat, someone was asking about the Radio Free Europe, and I can come back to it later. But I think there was not insignificant number of people who was able to get information, for example, from the Austrian television, or even Hungarian television, or even a Polish television, which at that time had been much more free and much more open, much more liberal societies. And of course, Austria was a free country, so all those who were living in the reach of the Austrian television and radio signal also benefited from having access to uncensored information. Of course, it would require you to understand German, but I think that was an important part of at least the southern border and western border and of Czechoslovakia at that time.
Mm-hmm. And Boris, I have a question. You were referring to the 60s, right? But in 68, it was smashed. And you yourself were in your early 20s, I assume, when the Velvet Revolution kicked off. So
Yes.
How did you have contact with that liberal era of the 60s? Was this something your parents told you about, or your grandparents?
Yeah, well, I think the 60s was, and the 68 and the occupation, I think this was a trauma, and this was something that in every family, well, I put it in other words, the whole period after 1968, at least in the way how I interpret that period based on my experience and the way how I reflected the world in the late 80s or yeah, in the early 80s, late 80s, was that the normalization and the whole period after 1968 until 1989 was a fake system. It was something that there were two levels. One was the reality as the regime wanted us to understand it, and another one was the consensus of playing this theater that everybody knew that this was a fake, but everybody acted as if everybody knew that it is a fake, but nobody would be able to tell it openly and publicly. So I think there was this strange game that was played at all levels of the society, and only in the private circles or in the family circles where people were able to talk freely, they could poke jokes and fun of the regime. But on the public side, most people would be very afraid. But even if it came to any, well, in a for example, in the sphere of you know, in the school, even our teachers, I attended university at the time, even those teachers who were mostly most ardent communist, and we knew that they are kind of members of the party, and even many of them were rather shallow in their presentation of these ideas. We could see that even themselves did not believe what they preach. So I think that I think my reading of that period of the 1968 until 89 was that the whole ideological construction was already rotten, and the whole system was standing on the clay legs. I mean, it was very fragile, but at the same time it was still very robust, given the power structure and the control over the so-called power structures in the society. I mean, having control over the army, the police, the militia, and all of these centers of a brachial power of the. And I think that somehow explains this.
Which is something I actually find really fascinating when Gabriela and I were doing research on the Velvet Revolution and the '89 movement, was how innocent the demands of the government for change were. I mean, like, it was in the case of the student movement, it was about better dormitories.
Well, I would correct that a little bit. Perhaps, I mean, there could be a variety of background documents and information how that situation evolved. But I would say that the student movement requirements or demands that the student movement put up, they were also evolving, and I think one need to differentiate between well, I think what was happening in the Prague, and also there was a little bit different dynamic at play what was happening in Slovakia. In Prague, the demonstration on the 17th of November was a demonstration commemorating the murder of Jan Opletal, who was murdered by Nazis after the regime in 1939, when the regime was when students were protesting and the Nazis captured and imprisoned some of the leaders and killed Jan Opletal, and it was organized by the city committee of the Socialist Union of Youth. So it was basically a demonstration which was announced, which was required according to the socialist law, and it was a legal and approved demonstration that was organized by official institution of official organization of youth organization. However, that organization was that the demonstration had been also a morphed into a platform of presenting and declaring and calling for more freedom and more democracy, and students were rather vocal and perhaps more courageous as their parents. And I think, and we can have a discussion about what role did the former STB played in it, like the secret police, and to what extent this was playing into cards of the progressive, so-called progressive wing of the Communist Party. But in Slovakia, in 16th of November, which was Thursday, which was the day before the 17th, students organized a spontaneous kind of a march across the city, where they were also calling for educational reforms, but they were also calling for more freedom and more democracy. And they were expressing themselves in a very spontaneous, self-organized way. And on the next week, on Monday, when after the terrible events happened in Prague, Slovak students had basically gathered and were calling for investigation of this massacre at the Národní třída in Prague. But they were also in a very short period of time, which took maybe less than a week, were calling not just for investigation and for punishment of those who were responsible for this action, but also they were calling for freedoms that would allow freedom of opinion, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and they were aligning their demands with the Public Against Violence, which was the political movement, emerging political movement, and their demands had been basically political demands as well. And I remember very well when we were on the first day of our gathering at the Comenius University, when there was, I don't know, maybe 800 students in the aula, in the convocation hall, and the communists who were trying to steer the gathering, they kind of tried to push the discussion of the gathering towards those daily issues of life of students, like the dorms and the cafeteria and etc. But we were resisting that, and we were putting to the fore the political issues and the political agenda, because we knew this was the strategy of the communists to kind of tame the emerging movement that was just growing up. So I think it wasn't really that a abrupt change from the demands of students to have a better dorms to political demands to have free elections. I think it was that the political demands had been there already because they were building on interest of students who were open-minded, who were very much discontent with the situation in the country, and many of them, or some of them, who had been very, I would say, politically aware and had created their own private spaces in which they politically socialized. They were able to formulate demands which were already up to the situation which was there.
So
I
I have,
because there was a question, sorry, which I find personally very interesting. I'm back too.
yay!
So this was an era that made it very difficult for people to trust each other. You never really knew who you were dealing with. So there was one question in the chat asking within your group that was organizing these activities, how did you know who to trust? Like, how did you have anybody infiltrating the group? Were there any secret agents? Like, how did you handle the operations in this atmosphere of distrust?
Well, the thing is that we knew that there were, perhaps there was maybe 300-400 students in the year of our faculty and of our school, and naturally some students inclined with others because they shared interest in politics, they shared interest in debating different stuff, and they shared also different opinions. And at that time already, you would have three types of people that would naturally cluster. You would have people who would be who would not be very open, but would be critical to the regime. You would have people who would be disinterested, and basically they would be interested in their own life and going for a hike or going skiing or just having fun. And then you would have people who would be playing the game and who would be kind of showing up with all the communist rituals and ceremonies and would be signing up to the candidates of the party. And if you live with these people, if you engage with them, if you interact with them in the school, you soon realize who is who and whose interests are where and who is kind of moving where. And there was naturally a group of people that I was a member of that we shared common interest to be outside of the system. We didn't want to play that game, but we didn't really care. But at the same time, we did not have kind of a mistrust to each other, partly because you could live in a complete paranoia that you cannot trust anyone, but at some point you need to trust to someone. And perhaps there were some people who had been playing on both sides. I am not aware of it, and I was not aware of it at that time. So perhaps there was some kind of a self-selection, and at the same time, we wouldn't be completely conspired. There was nothing about conspiracy of people that would be, kind of completely paranoid that somebody is spying on them. Of course, if I received a book of Milan Šimečka, which was one of the dissident writers, I probably I would be very careful whom I give it, whom I will pass it to. And I would pass it to a person that I would be 100%, this is a trusted person. Or because I knew that if that book would be, someone could use that book as a reason for imprisonment. I know people who were imprisoned because they were reading George Orwell's 1984. I had this book from a friend of mine who was an American. I was in touch with him. He was traveling across the border, and he was bringing me these types of books. And I had this book. I read it, and at that time I would never realize that I could be imprisoned for it. But after the Velvet Revolution, I learned that someone in Banska Bystrica was found with this book, and he received 6 months in jail because of reading this book. So there were also there were different spaces, and of course we had to be careful, but wouldn't be completely conspired.
Mm-hmm.
At the end, we were. Yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
No. I think this was a public university, and at some point we knew that there are people who are watching us and who are providing reports, but as long as they were not threatening us anyway, we would be pushing the borders to maximum. I have a friend who was 1 year older. He was studying history and archive sciences, and he attended the so-called candle demonstration in March '88, and he had been also investigated, and he was almost fired from the university. But I think for the intervention of one person who was a Professor Novak, he was able to stay, and he was able to continue his studies. I was around the demonstration, but I was not in the middle of it, in the epicenter, and I was not caught. So I kind of, was able to go through it without any consequences. But this is just to illustrate that the regime was already was not so hard as in the 50s, or perhaps in the early 70s, when the response of the regime was rather strong.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But still, what from my perspective, or having grown up in a non-communist society, it just seems like there must have been so much self-censorship and kind of pressure that you were under to always be aware of this omnipotent system that you either had to play along with, or hide from. Yeah. And just, you're really bringing it actually home to us by telling us that people were within your own personal network imprisoned for having a book like George Orwell's. That is just such a form of extreme censorship from my perspective. My generation growing up with the internet and having access to all this information all the time, to live in the society where there was actually an apparatus that would go after the individual for having blacklisted material as tame as George Orwell's book, not some kind of, secret how to do a military revolution. But I have a question. I was always very fascinated with what role did the collapse of the Berlin Wall play in the Czechoslovak Velvet Revolution as students on the ground? Well,
again, in the bubble that I lived in '89 or '88, '87, it was a bubble that was, I would say, interested in politics, and we were, most of us were listening to Radio Free Europe or the BBC or the Voice of America. This was a part of the information space that we were drawing on. So when the Berlin Wall was falling, this was not something that we would learn from some censored media. Of course, you wouldn't even learn about it in the press. You could, of course, see it in the Austrian TV because it was widely reported in ORF1, and you could also, but you would hear that a lot in the Radio Free Europe because it was something extremely important. And at that time, it was also there was this period between August, September, and October when Eastern Germans were trying to reach Austria or Germany. And many of them sought a refuge at the German embassy in Prague. So there was this few days or few weeks when there were hundreds of Germans who were basically exiled in the compound of the German embassy. And we learned about it from the Radio Free Europe, or as I said, the Voice of America. And then at that time, you could think that, well, this is a clear sign that things are falling apart here. So why to be tame, and why not to go out to streets and demand the fall of the regime Well, that's to me, it's the analogy with the zoo. We did not believe at that time that what is happening in Eastern Germany would be happening exactly the same in Czechoslovakia, because we already knew what was happening in Hungary a year ago, or in Poland in that year, and there were no signs at all that something similar, a kind of a loosening of the regime, loosening of the grip, and would be happening in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was very stiff in terms of the communists and the type of communists who were at power, and the regime was still very strong. It had the army, it had the police. So we were not thinking, and I was not thinking, and even on the 16th of November, I was not thinking that in 10 days or in 2 weeks there will be a new government, or that there will be a discussion about the removal of the Article 4 of the Constitution on the leading role of the party. So I think it came on the retrospect. I think I was naive, but at that time it looked to me only natural to be skeptical, and the regime was still very strong and could crack anybody who would be opposing it. I believe it because it had the power to do it. And yeah, so that's how I experienced it.
It's kind of a miracle that change came. Jesus, it sounds so like impossible, you know?
Yeah.
And I think, again, I think now that we're in quarantine, no matter which country we're in, we can kind of really understand the power of the police and the military to crack down on any kind of not normal behavior, you know? I mean, in the case of India, when the quarantine, I'm just going to give a quick example, when the quarantine was implemented, and obviously a big population, 1.3 billion people, not everyone took it seriously, and they were continuing to go into the streets and ride their scooters, and they actually had police physically assault people symbolically with batons, to send the message that, like, if they don't fall in line, if they don't stay at home for the greater good of society to protect them from this threat, this virus threat, there will be corporal punishment. And that's just the first layer of government enforcement.
Yeah.
Dear everyone, would like to encourage you, if you'd like to ask a question, just unmute yourself and ask away. It's an amazing opportunity.
And it's just to finish that, like, so that definitely makes you think twice to step out of line, because you don't want to be physically assaulted unless you're like, you know, Joan of Arc. Most people aren't, you know?
Yeah.
So questions, please.
Also, there
David.
was one, or sorry.
Yeah, this is David Frankel. I'll ask a couple of questions.
Great.
Just raise your hand, Boris, if you can hear me, so I know you can hear me well. Great. Okay. First question is, what was the reaction, if any, of the USSR troops that were in barracks in Czechoslovakia during the Velvet Revolution? Why don't you answer that? And also, did people monitor what was going on with the barracks? Why don't you answer that before, and I'll mute, and then I'll go to my second question. All
right. So, I mean, as a student at that time, I would not be aware of and I wouldn't have any information about the Russian troops, what was happening in the bases where they were stationed, and they were not really in Bratislava or around Bratislava, so that I could observe it visibly. I could only see police and the riot police that was gathering in the streets next to the square where the largest gatherings took place. And so I was expecting that there might be a police intervention against the gatherings, against the demonstrations where we were attending on that week. But as the Russian troops are concerned, or the Soviet troops, I was not aware at that time. Later on, I realized that there were Russian advisors who were already who were all the time in Prague, and the KGB was already there. And of course, there is a whole kind of a parallel story that explains the relationship between the Soviet communists and Czechoslovak communists at that time, and the interest of the Soviet regime to kind of nurture the change within the Czechoslovak conservative communist party that was keeping entrenched in the positions that were not more defendable, and that actually those progressives in the Communist Party were behind the oral reaction in Prague that led to the violent suppression of the demonstration, and that triggered the events. But those events that it triggered basically went out of hands of any kind of control, and that's what we call now is the Velvet Revolution. But as the Russian troops are concerned, I think they stayed low at that time.
Low profile. Actually, not many, I haven't met many Czechs and Slovaks that actually had any kind of engagement with any of these troops at any of these military.
As a personal witness, I have seen Russian soldiers only once in my life, or Russian Soviet soldiers only once in my life, when I was in a high school trip to Velký Krtiš, which is in southern central Slovakia, and there was a relatively large military compound that stationed, the tank troops, and we have seen them moving on the country roads. And that was the first time I've seen Soviet soldiers in Czechoslovakia.
And how was how was that explained to you as students? You were with obviously a teacher authority.
Well, again, this was this game that everybody played. I mean, we all knew these are Russian soldiers that stayed here since 1968, and they're here in order to maintain the obedience of the country, and the teachers were either ignoring this, and we were taking it as a fact. I mean, you're in the bus and you go to a trip with your class, so you see these tanks, sounds interesting, looks fun, and you can poke some jokes around it, but that's all what you can do. I mean, life goes on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I could turn to my second question, which is a different question entirely. That is the STB secret police files. What happened with those files after the Velvet Revolution? And then on a personal note, have you ever looked at your file? Now again, I'll mute.
Okay. Well, the files of the STB became a extremely valuable commodity, not from the perspective of historians or archive studies, but because of the fact that they were used as a tools of extortion and of political manipulation, because they served as an explosive material that could be used for decades after. And even now, so the files, especially those files which were related to people who were active in politics after 1989, those files became really a valuable resource. Some people who were extremely skilled in the political manipulation and learned very quickly that this can become a source of their political capital, like Vladimir Mečiar, who was our prime minister 3 times, and he had been known for using these files to forge political agreements and alliances and to manipulate the whole political scene of Slovakia. But many of these files were immediately destroyed upon the orders of General Lorenz, who was the deputy head of the STB in '89. But not all of them were destroyed, and especially those that were not destroyed became then the valuable political extortion resource. Other files, which were not so-called I don't know how to say it in English, but basically destroyed, cut. They are still available, and they serve as a background now, and these files are used now for a study of history of that period. Me personally, I have not seen a file that would relate to me. As far as I know, my name was not in the files, so there was not a file that would be set on me personally. But I have seen recently several files which were reporting on student activities at our school during the November days, and yes, and I was, but those were rather inaccurate and of a rather poor quality. But perhaps there is something more that I could access in future, but I did not.
Does anybody else have a question? No. Oh, actually, there was a question in the chat earlier about Radio Free Europe. Who listened to it?
Mm-hmm.
How influential was it? What impact did it have in Czechoslovakia?
Well, I think we live in times when you ask this question, like who is listening to what media and who watches what channel and how trusted is this channel, etc. You get immediately an answer with a rather deep analytical value. But now, I mean, asking this question about Radio Free Europe, first it was banned to listen. There was the regime put quite a high effort to provide a signal that would be disturbing the clarity of the signal. So you would have to always fine tune, you know, kilohertz to the right or to the left to get the right signal, because the state signal was interfering with it. And I think who listened to it? Well, all those people who were interested in knowing what's happening politically really in Czechoslovakia, and who wanted to get an uncensored views and news. But again, how deep was the penetration? It's hard to tell. I don't know. I know that in my family, my father was listened to it, so I listened to it as well, and I know that other people were listening to it, but for some people it was completely a new thing. Some people were not aware of it at all, and some people might have been very afraid of listening to it. So I mean, during the Second World War, listening to radio was really banned, and if someone was caught with a radio, he could go to jail. Some people may have thought this would be the case in Czechoslovakia, and perhaps, but it would be hard to prove. I don't know of anyone who would be jailed because of listening to Radio Free Europe in the normalization period, but I have not studied that particular aspect. But I think that Radio Free Europe played an important role, and even if it was politically charged, and it had a clear mission to provide besides providing uncensored news, it was also to provide a certain view that would be discrediting the communist system. One could see that intention, and that was also a little bit annoying at times, because one would want to know a little bit more also what was really happening inside the Communist Party and inside the system. But the Radio Free Europe had a really hard time to get that information, because it was relying on the sources of dissidents, or it was relying on the broader sources of what was happening in the region and what was happening in the world. But again, to me it was really something very important, and I was really a frequent listener of the evening edition of the political news.
Yes, thank you. Do you have any other questions? Anyone?
Question? I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, Mark?
Oh, yes, thank you.
Yes.
So, not necessarily talking about the past, but the current situation in Slovakia, Czech Republic. I heard recently, and I don't have something I can cite that says this is actually the case, or I haven't seen the actual survey, but my understanding is recently that even in the Czech Republic today, that there is sort of a reminiscent feeling for communism. People remember what they think are the good points per se, like they remember, you know, sort of a guarantee of a job or some sort of food on the table kind of thing. And when I first heard this, I asked, is this the younger people because they're hearing something, they didn't live through it, or is this older people? And I was told, no, it's a lot of people, that there's a high percentage of people that still have today some sort of feelings about communism, that perhaps maybe it wasn't so bad, because I mean, every system's got its downfalls, right? Whether it's capitalism or socialism. And so I'm wondering what you see the current state of things, because there's a lot of things too that we talked about, and I'm sorry, I don't want to run down a rabbit hole here, but a lot of things that we talked about today that you look at and you can see how things were manipulated for them to gain control. And so I'm wondering how in today's climate people are feeling about communism in Slovakia and in the Czech Republic, and how you know, how real that, what I'm hearing is, I guess is the way to say it.
Well, you're certainly right. You have a good information. I think the nostalgia for communism in Czech Republic as well as in Slovakia has been basically rising over the years. There are interesting studies that show that I mean, you can look at it from the two perspectives. From one, you can look at how do you evaluate the political nature, or the nature of the political regime before 1989. How many people would consider the regime positive versus negative? And you see that those people who consider it negative is decreasing. It's decreasing in Czech Republic, it's decreasing in Slovakia, and perhaps it's decreasing in Slovakia even more. So there is a kind of a rising nostalgia for the regime, for the communist past, and it is really a puzzling question, like why is that, and why is it increasing? And there might be also some differences between Czech Republic and Czechs and Slovaks, and also what is interesting is that many people think of the communist Czechoslovakia, and I refer here to the normalization period, to those 80s or 70s and 80s, as a period when people were nicer to each other, and when there was a kind of a stronger cohesion in the society. And one can look at different answers to this question. I recently did wrote a short paper on that, and I identified I looked through the literature, and I looked also to reading newspapers, reading them, watching kind of what's happening around me, is that I identified maybe 2 or 3 possible reasons. One would be the historical reasons that I think that has something to deal with the Slovak low interest in history. So in other words, the historical consciousness or historical awareness of Slovaks is relatively low, in a sense of the way how history is viewed and positioned in the public life, or how much is history given a space in the public discourse, in the media, or how historical documentaries are viewed, etc. So as if the interest of us would be more to the present and the future rather than to the past. And when we look to the past, we tend to remember those nicer parts, right? And in the past, we were younger, the world looked better, brighter. So there is certain kind of a nostalgia for the times when everything looked a little bit better. We not necessarily have to remember all immediately on the political aspects and all the negative elements that were accompanying the communism, but we remember those nicer parts of it. And those nicer parts are also in that communal life, in that the time and space that allowed people to interact among their friends in their gardens, in their cottages. Basically, there was not much to do because you could not do your work properly, you could not develop intellectually, you could not develop scientifically, you could not develop professionally. So then you had to spend some time with your friends, and that was nice. And I think that is part of that kind of that commemorative optimism that we remember those things that are comforting and that make us feel good. But then there is a second major group of reasons, or second major group of potential factors that contribute to that nostalgia, and I would call them the perceptions of inequalities. There is an interesting paradox that if you look at the social inequalities across the country comparison, Slovakia is one of the most equal societies in Europe, or most equal countries in terms of socioeconomic equalities. Yes, we do have a huge issue with the population of Roma that is highly segregated and highly marginalized and underdeveloped socially and economically, and lives basically in a poverty. But overall, our society is rather equal. Yet the inequalities that have emerged after '89 perhaps have been amplified by the increased sensitivity to these inequalities. And despite Slovakia had gone through a quite significant economic growth and social growth, and I think we were living in a much better conditions than we did in the early 90s. We still tend to feel ourselves a little bit more disadvantaged, or a little bit more, that things are not as good as they should be to us. And I think there is this perceived inequality and perceived perceived problems that are perhaps not as huge as we perceive them. And I think that may contribute to that nostalgia as well, because communism is in the propaganda and in the public image is portrayed as an equal society where everyone had what one needed, and there was not an abundance, but there was everything to satisfy your material needs. And I think that contributes to that kind of this nostalgic sentiment, at least in some part of population. And the third one is, of course, the power of propaganda. Let's not forget that the nostalgia for communism is often used by populist politicians who use that nostalgia to fuel their political support, and also when we look at the disinformation campaigns that are taking place in the last 6-10 years, we can see that a lot of conspiracy, whatever alternative media present the reality and the history in a very different way, and many people draw on that as well. So I think if you combine all these things, then you end up with a statistically significant outcome of increasing nostalgia for communism.
I have actually a question. Why I read in multiple sources that Slovakia has one of the biggest conspiracy theory followings out of even the Central European former Soviet bloc countries. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it is exactly there might be again more kind of a subtle cultural and historical reasons to that, which would, in my interpretation and my explanation, would relate to low level of historical awareness and our kind of and because that there is a void, there is an empty space which is looking for some narratives. If there is enough feed of interesting narratives into that void, then it gets filled with these narratives, and they basically occupy that space. And so unlike Hungary, for example, or Poland, or even Czech Republic, I would say that Slovakia is highly susceptible to these conspiracy theories because they provide an explanation to complex questions, and for those you really need to know a little bit more about your history. And if you're not aware of it, and if you're not interested in it, then interesting narrative can exploit that. And that to me would be the yeah.
I was just going to say capture your imagination. Just to add to that commentary, Gabriela and I, this year on the 30th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, we toured 22 schools, predominantly in Eastern Slovakia, spoke to about 2,000 students. And one of the recurring issues that was coming up when the teachers were talking to us was the lack of historical awareness, which goes back to the communist regime and possibly also the transition process, which there's not, there's not actually a lot of historical education like in the timetable for these high school students. I think in the beginning it's something like once a week for a year or maybe 2 years, and then it completely drops off. So they don't have to continue to have history taught to them in school as they proceed through their education. But I think one of the reasons there's also this historical neglect is the fact that we, as a relatively young country, and unlike our neighbors, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Poland, never had our kingdom. So when it was the empires before the First World War, the 4 empires in Europe, we were not part of that. We were actually a province or a rural region that was absorbed into the Uhorsko, the Hungarian kingdom. So we don't have like a history to be proud of per se, or we're not used to presenting our historical narrative because we've never been in that position. And this is so new. Since 1993, we've only had this privilege.
Yes, certainly this is a part of our historical heritage, and that plays out into our low level of historical awareness. But at the same time, I think it has a relationship to our statehood and to our theory of our state and the way how we look at our state. And I think the historical kind of evolution of Slovaks in the 20th century, it's amazingly accelerated evolution, right? From a nation that was almost 1.8, that was even less than 1.8 million, that was with, I don't know, 200, 400, 500 university educated intelligentsia in late 1917 to basically a country and in a democratic society and a member of European Union, part of the OECD and part of the developed world. I think Slovaks have made a huge advance, huge leap in terms of their social and institutional and political development. And I think that is a price we pay for it. I mean, this was an accelerated growth for which we were not able to catch up in our on the level of our societal awareness or consciousness. And building the historical consciousness takes time, takes generations. Traditions of political traditions, especially, they need to be built over generations. And I think we were struggling with that. And even our modern historical awareness is not built on any consensus. Our view of history is also highly polarized because of the Slovak state, the war state, 1939, 1945, and the heritage and the legacy of that state in our narrative, and I think that is contributing to that lack of basic consensus, and I think that is a challenge ahead of us, and yeah, it's only time will show how we cope with this.
Okay, thank you so much. Do you have any last questions, ladies and gentlemen? Anyone?
Could be, what are main difficulties of democracies in Slovakia after 91 or 89? What are main difficulties for the transition to democracy?
Well, right now, I think we're a country that is considered a constitutional democracy, and perhaps the quality of democracy might be declining in last few years. I think we're doing relatively well compared to countries like Hungary or Poland in our region. Certainly much better than Ukraine or Moldova or some Balkan countries. So in terms of, I would call Slovakia a democracy that has its problems, but that is struggling. And what are the problems of Slovakia for the future? Well, in terms of the politics, the political system, I think we will be. I think these challenges are similar to any other Western democracies that are now facing the rise of a populism as a new way of politics, or as a new way of presenting the political agenda, and that populism may be also bringing into political discourse measures or changes that might be infringing some of the democratic rights and liberties that we enjoy. And so I think there is this danger of kind of deterioration of democratic practices and democratic principles. But I would say that we're doing well, and I believe that we will be able to defend it. In terms of economic development, I think Slovakia faces huge challenge with the automation and how to restructure in vis-a-vis the 21st century, which is requiring much higher added value and which is requiring much higher skilled labor and a skilled contribution to its economic activity. Right now, Slovakia is completely, or to a large extent, dependent on assembly of high-quality cars. However, that is extremely endangered by the rise of automation, and our contribution to the interconnected world, even if in the post-corona world, is an open question. And for that, we need to change our educational, research, as well as service sector in order to be more valid member of a global community. I think these would be the two main challenges, and perhaps on the societal one, it is also the trust and the cohesion in the society, and of course corruption, which was one of the main reasons why there was a change in the government in the last elections, because the corruption was so pervasive and was basically capturing the state institutions, including the judiciary, and that I would see also as a major problem for us, how to settle, how to address these problems that we have in the judiciary, especially with the corruption in judiciary.
Yeah, but do you think that the quality of living of Slovaks are better in the 2000s? If you compare the quality of living, Under
quality of living. Well, certainly. Well, depends, of course, what would you measure and what would you compare. If you take all the quality of life indicators that might be in the Human Development Index of the UN, you would see increases and surpluses. So from the life expectancy to education levels, or even well, to variety of other health indicators, we are doing much better than we did in 1989. However, this is the trend for most of the developed countries and for the most countries in Europe. Now the question is, how are we doing in comparison to countries that we can be comparing with? That means countries like Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, or some of the other not Soviet, but post-communist countries. And I think we're doing relatively well. Of course, things could be much better. But even on your question, if we live better than we lived during the communism, yes, we live better. However, there is one caveat there. There is a group of people that does not live better, and this is Roma. Roma live in a poorer conditions than they lived by the end of the 80s. Their communities had basically been the major losers of the transformation to capitalist society and the democratic society, and that is one of the big problems that Slovakia carries forward.